The salt spray felt like a ghost against Hana's skin, a cold reminder of the ocean that had separated her from everything she had ever known. It was August 1945, and the world had ended. The Emperor's voice, once a divine tremor through the radio, had crackled with an unfamiliar human fragility, announcing a surrender that was still impossible for her to comprehend. Now, the enormous belly of the American transport ship groaned as it sliced through the waters of Puget Sound, carrying its cargo of ghosts. Hana and the other women, mostly nurses and administrative staff from the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, were huddled together on the deck, their thin cotton uniforms offering little protection against the damp chill of this new continent. They had been told the Americans were demons, beasts in human form, who knew nothing of honor and who would inflict unspeakable shame upon them. For weeks, the ship had been a floating vessel of whispered fears. They spoke of the stories they had heard, of the propaganda posters that depicted monstrous, leering GIs with claws for hands. The older woman beside Hana, Mrs. Sato, a head nurse whose stern face was now a mask of hollowed-out terror, had quietly sharpened a small piece of metal, a final tool to preserve her honor should the demons come for her. Hana clutched a small, worn photograph of her parents in her pocket, the paper softened by the constant touch of her trembling fingers, a last anchor to a world that no longer existed. The silence of the Americans was perhaps the most unnerving weapon in their arsenal. There was no shouting, no gloating, no dragging of women into dark corners as the propaganda had promised. The guards, impossibly tall men with faces that seemed too young for their uniforms, moved with a quiet, almost bored efficiency. They herded the women into lines with simple hand gestures, their voices calm and low, speaking a language that sounded like stones tumbling in a river. Hana watched them, looking for the flicker of barbarism, the hint of the monstrous cruelty she had been conditioned to expect. She saw none. She saw only a profound and unsettling indifference, as if they were merely processing inventory, not defeated enemies. This calm was more terrifying than any scream. It suggested a world of rules and procedures that were entirely alien to the code of Bushido, a code that now felt like a fragile, shattered piece of porcelain in her mind. As they were marched down the gangplank and onto the soil of this new, terrifying land, the air itself felt different. It was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a clean, wild smell so unlike the coal smoke and dust of the cities she had known. She braced herself for the first blow, the first insult, the first violation of her spirit. She had promised herself she would not cry out, that she would meet her fate with the silent dignity her culture demanded of her. The land that unfolded before them was a vast, impossible green. From the barred windows of the train that carried them inland, Hana saw forests that stretched to the horizon, mountains capped with lingering snow even in the summer heat, and wide, shimmering rivers that snaked through the landscape. There were no signs of war here, no bombed-out buildings, no skeletal remains of factories, no faces etched with the familiar grief of loss. There were small towns with neat wooden houses, fields where strange fat cows grazed peacefully, and long empty roads that seemed to lead to forever. This placid scenery was a profound psychological assault. It was the landscape of a nation untouched by the devastation it had wrought upon others. The women stared out the windows in a state of stunned silence. Every mile of pristine countryside was another nail in the coffin of the reality they had been taught. Where was the decadent, collapsing society the generals had spoken of? Where were the signs of a people weakened by materialism and a lack of martial spirit? All they saw was strength, space, and an unnerving, almost arrogant peace. The train ride itself was a disorienting experience. They were given small boxes containing bread, soft, white bread, not the gritty, dark loaf of their rations. and a piece of cheese that tasted strange and pungent. Some women refused to eat it, whispering that it was surely poisoned. But Hannah, driven by a gnawing hunger that had become a permanent part of her, ate hers slowly, her body betraying her pride with every bite. The food was not a kindness. It was a statement of power, a demonstration of an abundance so vast it could be casually dispensed to its enemies. The train finally hissed to a stop in a cloud of steam, the sound seeming to tear a hole in the profound silence of the countryside. The heavy doors slid open with a metallic groan, and the women flinched as one. A collective intake of breath against the anticipated violence. An American guard, a young man with freckles scattered across his nose, simply stood by the opening, holding his rifle in a way that seemed almost casual, as if it were a farm tool. He gestured for them to get out, his expression unreadable. As Hannah stepped down onto the gravel, the air struck her again, this time carrying a different scent, not of pine, but of something industrial and faintly antiseptic, like soap. The camp spread before them, a geometric pattern of long, dark wooden buildings enclosed by fences of gleaming barbed wire. The wire was exactly as she had imagined, a promise of confinement and despair. But everything else was wrong. There were no emaciated figures in striped uniforms clinging to the fences, no snarling dogs straining at their leashes, no guards perched in towers with machine guns aimed at their hearts. There was only a quiet, methodical order. Neat gravel paths ran between the barracks, and outside one building, buckets of water had been lined up in a perfect row, steam gently rising from them in the cool air. It was this meticulous organization, this almost theatrical cleanliness, that began to unravel Hannah's defenses more than any threat could have done. It felt like a meticulously prepared stage for a play whose plot she could not begin to guess. As they were led toward one of the long wooden huts, the women walked in a tight cluster, their eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the contradictions. This place did not feel like a punishment camp. It felt more like a sterile, soulless hospital or a remote boarding school. Inside the barracks, the strangeness continued. Rows of simple metal cots were lined up, each with a neatly folded blanket and a thin but real mattress. Sunlight streamed through glass windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Compared to the crowded, flea-infested billets and bombed-out field hospitals they had endured for years, this was an almost obscene level of consideration. Mrs. Sato, the nurse, ran a hand over one of the mattresses, her expression a mixture of disbelief and deep suspicion. "It is a trick," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They wish to soften us, to make us weak before the real suffering begins." The other women murmured in agreement, because that was the only explanation that made sense. Their entire worldview was built on the premise of the enemy's barbarism. To accept this clean, orderly reality as genuine would be to admit that their leaders, their generals, their emperor had lied to them on a fundamental level. And that was a more terrifying thought than any American demon. Hannah stood frozen in the middle of the room, the worn photograph in her pocket suddenly feeling heavy, a relic from a faith that was beginning to crumble. The Americans were not just their captors. They were the architects of a profound and deliberate confusion, and this quiet, sunlit room was their battlefield. A short, stout American woman with a severe haircut and a clipboard entered the barracks, her presence immediately silencing the nervous whispers. She spoke no Japanese, but through a series of sharp, efficient gestures, she communicated their first task. Each prisoner was to take a bar of soap from a crate, a coarse, pale yellow bar that smelled overwhelmingly of lye, and a thin but clean towel. They were then pointed toward a washroom, a concrete building from which steam was billowing. The concept was simple: but the implication was staggering. This was not a perfunctory cleansing to prevent disease. It was an enforced, structured part of their new reality. They were being stripped of their grime, the last physical remnants of the war, by their captors. For Hana, the act of washing under the gaze of the enemy felt like a profound violation, more intimate than a physical blow. The hot water was a shocking luxury, a pleasure so long forgotten that it felt painful. As she scrubbed her skin, she felt as if she were washing away not just the dirt of the journey, but a layer of her own identity. She was being remade, cleansed of her past by an enemy who offered soap instead of a sword. The shame was a burning coal in her stomach. Back in the barracks, they were issued simple, drab-green dresses made of a rough, starchy cotton. The uniforms were functional, sexless, and utterly foreign. As the women changed out of their tattered army-issued garments, a heavy silence fell over the room. They were being erased, their former selves packed away with their old clothes. The hours that followed were a void of quiet, anxious waiting. The women sat on their cots, avoiding each other's eyes, each lost in her own vortex of fear and confusion. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Hunger, which had been a dull ache, now sharpened into a throbbing, urgent pain. The small meal on the train felt like a distant memory, a brief reprieve before a long and certain starvation. Mrs. Sato began quietly humming a traditional folk song, a tune of loss and perseverance, and a few of the other women softly joined in, their voices thin and fragile in the cavernous room. It was an act of defiance, a small attempt to reclaim a piece of their shared soul in this sterile, alien place. Hana did not sing. She could only listen, the familiar melody clashing violently with the strange reality of her surroundings. The sound of a loud, clanging bell from outside shattered their mournful chorus. The door to the barracks swung open, and a guard stood silhouetted against the fading light. He motioned for them to come out, his gesture impatient. This was it. The softening was over. Now, they thought, the true nature of their captivity would be revealed. As they shuffled out of the barracks and formed a ragged line on the gravel path, a new smell drifted toward them on the evening breeze. It was a smell so completely foreign, so rich and overwhelmingly savory, that for a moment Hana's mind went blank, unable to process the sensory information. It was a greasy, smoky, salty aroma, a scent that spoke of a world of fat and fire she could not have imagined. The smell grew stronger as they approached a long, low building with smoke curling from a metal chimney. It was a scent that had no place in their world of deprivation, a rich, animalistic aroma that seemed to bypass the brain and speak directly to the hollow emptiness in their stomachs. Their steps faltered, a mixture of primal hunger and deep-seated revulsion pulling them in opposite directions. The guards gestured them inside, into a vast, noisy hall filled with long wooden tables. The source of the smell was immediately apparent, and the sight was so baffling that it momentarily erased their fear. At one end of the hall, soldiers stood behind a long metal counter, but they were not holding rifles. They were wearing white aprons splattered with grease. In front of them, huge black iron pans hissed and crackled, filled with glistening reddish-brown strips of meat that curled in the heat. The air shimmered with smoke and the spattering of hot fat. Hana stared, mesmerized by the sheer, unapologetic abundance. She had not seen this much meat in one place in over 5 years. The memory of her last proper meal, a small bowl of rice with a single precious salted plum, flickered in her mind, a pale ghost against this inferno of sizzling fat. The soldiers worked with a casual efficiency, using metal tongs to flip the strips of meat, their faces impassive, as if this were the most normal scene in the world. For the Japanese women, it was a vision from another planet, a decadent, almost violent display of nourishment. They were pushed forward in a line. Each woman handed a heavy ceramic plate, not a tin bowl, but a solid, substantial plate. A soldier slopped a spoonful of lumpy white potatoes onto it, followed by a thick slice of the soft, pale bread. Then another soldier, with a swift, indifferent motion, laid 2 strips of the crisp, sizzling meat on top. When the plate was placed in Hana's hands, she stared down at it, her fingers trembling. The heat from the food radiated upwards, a warmth that felt both comforting and deeply shameful. The bacon, as she would later learn it was called, was unlike anything she had ever seen. It glistened with fat, its edges charred to a delicate crisp. She found a place at one of the long tables, surrounded by the quiet sounds of other women grappling with the same impossible reality. Some began to eat immediately, their movements frantic, almost desperate. Others simply stared at their plates, tears welling in their eyes. Mrs. Sato sat rigid and upright, her hands folded in her lap. Her plate untouched, a silent statue of defiance. Hana's hunger was a roaring beast inside her. With a hand that shook so badly she could barely hold the strip, she lifted the bacon to her lips and took a bite. The effect was explosive. A wave of salt, smoke, and rich, fatty flavor crashed over her palate. It was overwhelming, intensely savory, and so profoundly foreign that her body reacted before her mind could. She felt a surge of pure physical relief that was so powerful it felt like a betrayal. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and unbidden, as she devoured the food, a desperate, shameful act of survival that erased every lesson of honor and restraint she had ever been taught. After the meal, they were marched back to their barracks under a sky now filled with a riot of unfamiliar stars. The silence on the return walk was heavier, more profound than before. It was the silence of women whose certainties had been violently uprooted. The taste of salt and fat still coated Hana's tongue, a phantom presence that was both a deep primal comfort and a source of burning shame. In her mind, she saw the face of her younger brother, his cheeks already gaunt when she last saw him, and she felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made her want to retch. To be full while her family starved was a moral stain, an unforgivable indulgence. By accepting the enemy's food, she had incurred a debt, a deeply dishonorable obligation, an on that could never be repaid. This was the true nature of the American strategy, she thought. They did not need to break their bodies with whips and chains. They could shatter their spirits with plates of food. It was a cruelty more sophisticated and insidious than anything the propaganda had described. The shared trauma of hunger had been a bond between the women, a source of collective identity. Now, even that was gone, replaced by a bewildering and divisive sensation of satiation. Back in the barracks, the fragile unity they had forged through song earlier in the evening had completely evaporated. The women separated to their cots, the scraping of the metal legs on the wooden floor the only sound. That night, sleep was an impossible refuge. The room was filled with the sound of quiet weeping, suppressed coughs, and the restless shifting of bodies on thin mattresses. Mrs. Sato sat bolt upright on her cot for hours, a silhouette of rigid disapproval in the moonlight, her untouched meal a silent judgment on them all. A few women whispered in a corner, their voices sharp with suspicion. They spoke of poisons that worked slowly, of drugs mixed into the food to make them docile and compliant. It was easier to believe in a chemical assault than a psychological one. Hana lay on her back, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, her stomach full for the first time in years, but her soul more tormented than ever. The physical comfort only amplified her spiritual anguish. She replayed the scene in the mess hall over and over in her mind, The apron soldiers, the sizzling pans, the casual abundance. One of the guards, a man with pale blue eyes, had watched them as they ate. He wasn't sneering or gloating. He had leaned against the doorframe, chewing on a matchstick, his expression one of mild curiosity, as if he were observing a strange new species at a zoo. At one point, his eyes had met Hannah's, and he had given a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture devoid of malice or pity. It was a simple acknowledgement of her existence, and it was more disarming than any weapon. It suggested a world where enemies were not monsters to be vanquished, but simply other people. This small human gesture cracked something deep inside her, letting in a sliver of terrifying doubt. If he was not a demon, then what was she? The next morning, and every morning that followed, began not with a scream or a blow, but with the same impersonal clang of the bell, and with it came the smell: bacon, coffee, and frying eggs. It became the scent of their captivity, an aromatic assault that they could not escape. The shock of the first night curdled into a bewildering routine. The Americans, it seemed, were masters of a mundane, relentless psychological warfare. There were no interrogations, no shouted indoctrinations, no demands for confessions of war crimes. Instead, there was a strict, unyielding schedule. Roll call at dawn, where they stood in silent rows as guards counted them with detached precision. Then came work assignments, simple tasks like peeling potatoes in the vast, steamy kitchens, scrubbing floors, or folding laundry that smelled of the same harsh soap they used on their own bodies. The orders were given in clipped, incomprehensible English, but the meaning was always clear. The discipline was absolute, yet it was devoid of the venomous, personal cruelty that had characterized their own military hierarchy. Here, they were not individuals to be broken, but components in a system to be managed. This impersonal efficiency was a constant source of friction against their own cultural understanding of power, which was always deeply personal, tied to honor, shame, and the visible submission to one's superiors. Hannah was assigned to the kitchens, a position that placed her at the very heart of her own confusion. Here, she witnessed the source of the camp's impossible abundance, and it was a daily torment. She saw crates of eggs stacked to the ceiling, sacks of flour and sugar, and enormous sides of pork and beef. She watched young American cooks, boys who whistled cheerful alien tunes as they worked, stirred giant vats of stew with paddles the size of boat oars. They moved with a casual, almost careless confidence, their movements unburdened by the specter of scarcity. The most painful thing to witness was the waste. Scraps of meat, day-old bread, and potato peels were scraped unceremoniously into large metal bins. Hannah would watch, her hands clenched, her stomach tight with a mixture of anger and anguish. She thought of the concept of motainai, the deep cultural shame of wasting something precious. For years, she had been taught that every single grain of rice was a gift, a testament to the farmer's labor and the emperor's benevolence. Here, the Americans discarded more food in a single morning than her family might have seen in a month. This was their true power. It was not in their bombs or their rifles, but in their ability to be so profoundly, insultingly wasteful. The cruelty was not in what they did to the prisoners, but in what they so effortlessly possessed. Just as the women began to settle into the strange, monotonous rhythm of camp life, a rhythm dictated by bells and bacon, the Americans changed their strategy. The battle for their stomachs was seemingly won. Now, a new front was opened, one that targeted their minds. One afternoon, they were led not to the kitchens or the laundry, but to a different barracks, one that had been cleared of cots. Inside, wooden benches were arranged in neat rows facing a large blackboard. The air smelled of chalk dust and old wood. The women exchanged wary, confused glances. Lessons? Here? The idea seemed ludicrous, another bizarre ritual in this upside-down world. A young American officer with spectacles and a serious expression stood at the front of the room. He did not smile. He began by writing a single word on the board in clumsy, block-like Japanese characters. Sekai, the world. Then he turned and began to speak, his words translated into halting Japanese by a nervous-looking Nisei soldier who stood beside him. He told them that their old world was gone, and to survive in the new one, they would have to learn. The lessons began with basic English vocabulary, simple, practical words like water, bread, and thank you. The women repeated the strange, soft sounds with reluctance, their mouths struggling to form the foreign shapes. It felt like a child's game, yet underneath it ran a current of profound gravity. To speak the enemy's language felt like the first step in a slow, inexorable surrender of the soul. A week later, the true purpose of these lessons became terrifyingly clear. They were herded into the mess hall after their evening meal. The tables had been pushed aside, and a large white sheet was hung on the far wall. A projector began to whir and click in the darkness, and grainy black and white images flickered to life. At first, they showed American cities, impossibly tall buildings, and wide avenues crowded with cars. Another display of the enemy's power. But then the scene shifted. The images that followed were a descent into a hell Hana had refused to believe existed. They were shown newsreels from Nanking. Images of emaciated Japanese soldiers grinning over the bodies of slaughtered civilians. They saw footage of emaciated American and Filipino prisoners on the Bataan Death March, their eyes hollow with a despair that transcended language. They saw the skeletal survivors of their own POW camps, living testaments to a cruelty that the films laid bare without commentary. The hall was utterly silent, save for the rattling of the projector. Hana sat frozen, her hands clenched into fists in her lap, her stomach churning. She had heard rumors, whispers among the soldiers of the things that were done in the name of the emperor, but they had been easy to dismiss as enemy lies. But the camera did not lie. The moving images were an irrefutable witness. The bacon had challenged her perception of the enemy. This was a far more devastating assault. This forced her to challenge her perception of herself. The Americans did not need to call them monsters. They simply held up a mirror. When the projector finally stopped and the harsh lights of the mess hall flickered back on, no one moved. The American officer and the Nisei translator stood silently at the front of the room, their faces unreadable, allowing the weight of the images to settle into the women's minds. There were no accusations, no lectures on morality. There was only the profound, damning silence. The walk back to the barracks was a funeral procession. The women who had once huddled together for comfort now seemed to shrink away from one another, as if proximity itself were an accusation. The shared identity of being Japanese, once a source of pride and solidarity, now felt like a shared stain. That night, the barracks became a battleground of shattered souls. Mrs. Sato, her face a rigid mask of fury, gathered a group of the older women around her. "Fakes," she hissed, her voice trembling with a conviction that was born of pure terror. "Clever American tricks. They use actors and paint to create these lies. They want to poison our spirit, seishin, to make us hate ourselves. To believe them is to surrender your soul. We must be stronger than their lies." Some women clung to her words like a life raft, their faces hardening with a renewed, desperate defiance. It was a more palatable reality than the alternative. Others simply crumbled. A young woman who had been a telegraph operator began to sob uncontrollably, a raw, animal sound of grief that went on for hours. She wailed for the emperor, for her family, for a truth she could no longer hold on to. Hana retreated to her cot, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin as if it could shield her from the turmoil in the room and in her own heart. The images from the film were burned onto the inside of her eyelids. She remembered a young, arrogant soldier in her field hospital in Manchuria, boasting of the contests they would have with Chinese prisoners. At the time, she had pushed his words away, dismissing them as the foolish, cruel bragging of a boy trying to act like a man. Now, his words returned to her with the force of a physical blow, recontextualized by the grainy newsreel footage. She had been a witness, a passive one, but a witness nonetheless. She had stood at the edge of the abyss and had chosen to look away. The denial of Mrs. Sato and the raw grief of the telegraph operator both felt alien to her. She could not force herself to believe the images were fake. They felt too real, resonating with the dark undertones of things she had already seen and ignored. But she also could not give in to pure despair. Instead, she felt a profound and terrifying hollowness. The pillars of her world, honor, duty, the divine righteousness of her nation, had been systematically dismantled. The bacon had proven the enemy was not a monster. The films suggested that perhaps she had been serving them. She was adrift in a moral vacuum, and for the first time, she felt a loneliness so complete it was like a physical death. In the weeks that followed the film screening, a fragile, bitter new order settled over the camp. The women were now divided into distinct factions. There were the deniers who followed Mrs. Sato with a renewed, almost fanatical loyalty, their faces masks of righteous anger. They performed their duties with a sharp, resentful precision and spoke only to each other, creating a wall of ideological purity around themselves. Then there were the broken, women who moved like ghosts through the camp, their eyes haunted, their spirits seemingly extinguished by the terrible knowledge they now carried. And then there were the ones in the middle, like Hana, who existed in a quiet, lonely limbo, unable to cling to the old lies, but unequipped to process the new truths. The English lessons continued, but now the room was half empty, and those who attended did so with a somber, desperate curiosity. The Americans, for their part, seemed oblivious to the internal schism they had created, continuing their routine with the same unnerving, methodical calm. Their strategy was patient, relentless, and brutally effective. They had planted a seed of doubt, and now they simply let it grow in the fertile soil of the prisoners' minds. One day, a new crate appeared outside the mess hall. It was not filled with food or soap, but with books. The American officer with the spectacles announced that a small library was being made available to them. The collection was a strange assortment of worn paperbacks and sturdy hardcovers. Most were in English, but a small section contained books translated into Japanese. Mrs. Sato and her followers looked upon the books as if they were venomous snakes, warning the others that these were just another tool of American propaganda. Paper filled with lies designed to further corrupt their souls. But Hana, starved for something to occupy her racing mind, found herself lingering by the crate after the others had gone. Her fingers traced the spines, the foreign titles and names a mystery to her. She picked up a slim volume, its cover depicting a large dog in a snowy wilderness. It was a Japanese translation of a book called The Call of the Wild. She had never heard of it. On an impulse she couldn't explain, she slipped the book into the pocket of her dress, her heart pounding as if she had just committed a serious crime. That night, Long after the barracks had fallen into a restless silence, she read by the thin sliver of moonlight coming through the window. The story was simple, about a dog stolen from a comfortable home and forced to survive in a brutal, wild new world. But as she read, she felt a strange and powerful resonance. The dog, Buck, had to unlearn everything he knew, shedding his civilized instincts to embrace a more primal, individualistic nature in order to survive. It was a story of a world with no honor, only the raw, fierce imperative to live. Reading became Hana's secret ritual, a private act of rebellion against the crushing certainties of both Mrs. Sato's defiance and the other women's despair. The book about the dog was a strange comfort, a parable of survival that spoke to her in a language deeper than words. She began to see the camp not as a place of honor or shame, but simply as a wilderness, a new environment with its own brutal rules for survival. This mental shift created a chasm between her and the other prisoners. She no longer felt a part of their shared struggle. She was an observer, a solitary animal learning to navigate a strange and hostile landscape. Her isolation was complete. She performed her duties in the kitchen, ate the rich, foreign food that still felt like a secret indulgence, and repeated the soft, alien sounds of the English language in the half-empty classroom. But her true life was lived at night, in the sliver of moonlight on her cot, where she traveled through the snowy wastes of the Yukon alongside a fictional dog. A journey that felt more real to her than her own waking life. This detachment, however, came at a cost. The constant mental and emotional strain began to wear on her body. A persistent dry cough settled deep in her chest, and a low-grade fever left her perpetually chilled and weary. One evening during roll call, a wave of dizziness washed over her, and she stumbled, catching herself on the woman in front of her. The guard supervising them, a stern-faced sergeant, barked something in English. Before Hana could straighten up, another soldier stepped forward. He was shorter than the others, with the familiar high cheekbones and dark eyes of her own people. He was a Nisei, a Japanese-American, one of the handful who served as translators and liaisons in the camp. He looked at her, his expression not harsh, but concerned. He said something to the sergeant, who grunted and waved a dismissive hand. The Nisei soldier then turned to Hana and spoke, and the sound of his voice sent a shockwave through her. He was speaking Japanese, but it was the clumsy, heavily accented Japanese of someone who had learned it in a foreign home. "Daijoubu desu ka?" he asked. "Are you all right?" His grammar was slightly wrong, his pronunciation thick with the sounds of English. It was the language of her heart spoken with the tongue of the enemy. She was too stunned to reply, and could only nod. Later that night, as she lay shivering on her cot, the same Nisei soldier appeared at the door of the barracks. He came to her cot and, without a word, placed a thick wool blanket over her and set a steaming mug of what smelled like sweet tea on the floor beside her. He looked at her for a moment, his face a complex mask of pity and professional distance, then turned and left. Hana stared after him, the warmth from the mug seeping into her cold hands. This simple, personal act of kindness was the final, devastating blow. It was not the calculated generosity of a powerful system. It was one human being seeing the suffering of another, and that human being had the face of her brother. Hana did not drink the tea. She simply held the warm mug in her hands, letting the heat seep into her bones, a small anchor in a universe that was spinning out of control. The blanket, smelling faintly of wool and the same lye soap as everything else in the camp, was a heavy, comforting weight. The war inside her, The long and brutal siege between the ideology she had been raised with and the reality she was experiencing was finally over. The final wall had not been breached by a bomb or a newsreel, but by a simple, quiet act of compassion. A wave of something immense and powerful washed over her, and she finally allowed herself to break. Hot, silent tears streamed down her face, soaking the collar of her drab dress. They were not tears of shame for eating the enemy's food, nor tears of horror for the atrocities of her own army. They were tears of a profound and bottomless grief for the loss of a world. She wept for the girl who had believed in the divinity of the emperor, for the nurse who had believed in the righteousness of her cause, and for the woman who had believed that honor could be found in dying for a lie. That person was gone, and in her place was someone she did not know, a stranger, hollowed out by a truth that was as undeniable as the warmth of the mug in her hands. In that moment, all the baffling pieces of her captivity clicked into place. The bacon was not just food. It was a symbol of a world that did not recognize her scarcity. The clean barracks were not a trick. They were the product of a culture that valued a different kind of order. The films were not just propaganda. They were a mirror held up to a darkness she had refused to see. The books were not just poison. They were a doorway into another way of being. And the Nisei soldiers' kindness was not a strategic maneuver. It was proof that humanity could exist in the spaces between uniforms, between ideologies, between the conqueror and the conquered. It was a humanity that her own rigid code of Bushido, with its focus on death and duty, had seemingly forgotten. She realized that the Americans had not conquered her nation with their atomic bombs. They had conquered her, personally, with a wool blanket and a cup of tea. It was a surrender more complete and more devastating than the one the emperor had announced over the radio. She had lost not just a war, but a faith. As she finally drifted into a deep, feverish sleep, she felt a profound and terrifying sense of peace. The struggle was over. She had been defeated. But in that defeat, for the first time, she felt the faint, fragile possibility of being free. Hana woke the next morning to the familiar clang of the bell, but for the first time, it did not sound like a threat. Her fever was gone, and in its place was a vast, quiet clarity. The world had not changed. The barracks were the same, the air still carried the scent of frying bacon, and Mrs. Sato was still gathering her followers for their morning ritual of silent defiance. But Hana had changed. She was no longer a combatant in the war for her own soul. She was a quiet observer of its aftermath. When she ate her breakfast, she tasted the food without shame, accepting it for what it was, fuel for a body that was still miraculously alive. In the English class, she listened with a new intensity, not just repeating the sounds, but trying to understand the ideas behind them, the shape of the world that had created this language. She began to see the camp not as her prison, but as her strange, temporary reality. A surreal waiting room between a life that was over and one that had not yet begun. She was still a prisoner, but she was no longer captive to the ghosts of a fallen empire. She felt a profound, sorrowful pity for the other women, especially for Mrs. Sato, who was still fighting so fiercely to protect the honor of a nation that had lied to her, starved her, and led her to this cage. Hana realized that the most heavily fortified prison was not the one with barbed wire fences, but the one you built inside your own mind. She continued to read, not in secret anymore, but sitting openly on her cot. The other women left her alone, sensing that she had crossed some invisible line and was now lost to them. She finished the book about the dog and started another, a collection of simple American poems. The words were often difficult to understand, but she felt their rhythm. their celebration of individual lives, of nature, of small, quiet moments. It was an entirely different kind of beauty from the stark, self-sacrificing aesthetic she had been taught. Her world, once so small and rigid, had been cracked open, and while the experience was terrifying, it was also, in a strange way, liberating. The future was a terrifying blank, a return to a homeland that was now as foreign to her as this American camp. But she was no longer afraid of the truth. Hannah's entire world, her sense of self, honor, and enmity was shattered and then rebuilt by a single, unexpected act of humanity. Have you ever had a moment, a conversation, or an experience that completely changed your perspective on everything? We would be honored to read your story in the comments below. And if narratives like Hannah's, which explore these powerful, life-altering turning points, resonate with you, consider joining our community by subscribing so we can continue to bring them to light together. One morning, weeks later, Hannah stood by the window of the barracks, watching the sun rise over the distant, unfamiliar mountains. The air was crisp and clean, and from the kitchens, the faint, familiar scent of bacon began to drift across the camp. A year ago, that smell would have been an impossible fantasy. 6 months ago, it had been a symbol of shame and a weapon of confusion. Now, it was simply the scent of her morning, the backdrop to her strange, suspended life. The war for her soul was over. There had been no victor, only a negotiated peace, a treaty signed in the quiet territory of her own heart. She knew she would leave this place eventually, but she would never truly leave it behind. The camp, with its baffling kindness and its terrible truths, had become a part of her. It was a wound, but it was also a lens, a new way of seeing a world she no longer recognized. She would forever carry the taste of bacon on her tongue, a permanent reminder of the enemy who was not a demon, and the nation that was not divine. Her captivity had not broken her. It had hollowed her out, and in that emptiness, something new and fragile and resilient had begun to grow. The war had ended, but the real battle, the one for meaning, was only just beginning. Hannah's war inside the wire was over, but her journey toward understanding was just starting. Thank you for walking with her through this profound chapter of her life. If you were moved by her story and believe in the power of empathy to bridge the widest of divides, please consider subscribing to our channel. It's the most meaningful way to support us and ensure these stories continue to be told. We invite you to share what this story made you feel, or perhaps a memory from your own family's history, in the comments below. Let's build a community together that chooses to remember, to question, and to understand the complex shared humanity that connects us all.